Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in March 2022. And this is the kind of session that for me are really, really cool and powerful, and the ones that we really try to do at the summit, which is a sort of a collaboration of individuals who are super passionate about a particular topic, who really care about it, who have done a lot of thinking, and then we kind of come together and sort of challenge each other. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about the idea of using Wardley maps in security and how Wardley maps could be the missing piece of the puzzle when doing threat models. And I had this epiphany in one of the summits that we did in Woburn Center Parks, where we had an amazing set of sessions on Wardley map, and we had an amazing set of sessions on threat modeling. And there was a moment where you actually had, I believe it was Adam Stochak and a couple of others, I think it was Tony and a couple of others, sitting with Simon Wardley talking about this, and it was freaking amazing. But for me, the thing that is very interesting is that Wardley mapping, namely maps, introduces a couple of concepts that are missing in threat modeling. And I feel that the same way that in Wardley maps you need graphs, you need a set of use flows and basically use case mappings in order to really understand the sort of the value chain to make sense of it. In threat modeling, there's a context that is missing. And I feel that if we can start applying some of these concepts, more importantly, if we can then use all the amazing research that has already gone into Wardley maps, we can leverage a lot of it. So the thinking here, So the thinking here is, why don't we just start with a very quick introduction, so we kind of, everybody just set the tone, and I maybe we can just go, down the same line. So if we have Brook, Dave, Izar, Jakub, then me, then Krzysztof, and then Scott, if you can go in the end, because I think you're a key player here too. So just a quick introduction. Who are you? What you've done with Wardley maps and what you've done with threat modeling. Brook, over to you.
Okay. Well, my experience with Wardley maps, near zero. My experience with threat modeling. Who am I? Well, I am one of the authors of one of the very few books about threat modeling. It's up to you to decide whether it's any good. Some people find it useful, which is the point, after all. And a whole bunch of other books in the area of AppSec and software security. I've had a near 40-year high-tech career, along with 20-some years in cybersecurity or information security, pick of the word. And I've worked for a bunch of big tech companies. I've built software security programs, and I've literally done thousands of threat models. In the last 7 or 8 years, I've run around the world teaching threat modeling, and so thousands of people have been through my classes, and none of that makes me a good threat modeler. The proof is in the pudding. But I will say that I have some experience and thinking about threat modeling. I'm one of, along with a couple other people on this call, I'm one of the authors of the threat modeling manifesto, and I care deeply about it and think it's radically important. So that's why I'm here. And I just love getting into conversations with Dinis and Izar and Fraser. And so, and I'm looking forward to the other folks here too. Check.
Cool. Dave.
Yeah, okay, so I'm Dave Stein. My career is a bit shorter than Brook's. I started in information security, I think in 2008, something like that. I've always been trying to get development teams to do more with security and find ways that are as easy for them as possible to understand. So threat modeling obviously was one of the first things I did. I started out with Stride, stuff like that. But the thing is that quite often you do not have the proper diagram to actually do that properly. So I've been trying to figure out new ways to do threat modeling. I work with evil personas, and well, some year ago I tried to see if I could make Wardley mapping, if I could make that a viable tool to do threat modeling with. and I also wrote a blog about that, and Chris interviewed me on that, and apparently, yeah, you guys like that, and that was one of the reasons to invite me here. So I'm happy to share my thoughts about that. But my experience with threat modeling is quite extensive. My experience with Wardley maps, well, somewhat. The combination, I'm still also in the learning phase.
Cool. Izar? Is it here?
You?
Yeah. I can hear. No. If not, Jacob, can I give a quick intro?
Yep. Hi. So I have a consulting background where I've also created or co-authored a lot of threat models. And actually, I'll start using Wardley maps vocabulary. So I started commoditizing threat modeling by simply starting this instant threat modeling series, which were 5-minute videos on what can go wrong and how to avoid it. So now what I'm doing, I'm leading some AppSec initiatives by actually drawing some Wardley maps and trying to come up with what can we do better to make threat modeling and other AppSec activities more evolved.
Cool. So I'm Dennis. I think I've been thinking in graphs longer than I've been doing threat modeling and Wardley maps, but I've used threat modeling for a long time. I've also done a lot of threat modeling. I kind of was privileged enough to discover Wardley maps through the summit actually, and then have actually Simon Wardley participate in a couple of the summits, which was an amazing experience. This was actually on-site summits. It's really cool. And I feel that both threat modeling and Wardley maps provided a mental framework to explain a lot of things that I arrived sort of by instinct, but also allowed me to learn all sorts of new techniques and all sorts of ways to make it work. I still feel that I think more than I show, and this is one of the gaps I have, that I feel that we need to, like, Jacob, you're saying, we need to commoditize, we need to make it better, how to consume some of this information. But I do feel that in my head, I'm thinking in Wardley maps and I'm thinking threat modeling all the time. Chris?
Hi everyone. My name is Chris Daniel. I work for DXC, and in terms of what I'm doing, I'm having serious identity crisis, because the title says it's researcher, but in reality, it's more of a management consultant. I tend to lock people in one room, make them figure out what is the reality, and try and force them to make a plan which should sustain the first contact with the environment. So that's perhaps what I do, and I do it with the help of Wardley mapping. I know hardly anything about threat modeling, but I specialize in Wardley maps.
Cool. Izar, I think you're back on?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Yay, better than a Verizon commercial. So yeah. So I've been doing this threat modeling thing for a while now, and for some time before this, I have started focusing on how we do it. So the meta threat modeling, the methodologies that we use, the stuff that makes it easier for other people to start doing it. So my interest in Wardley maps is because I've seen it before in the summit itself, and I didn't quite get the whole thing. So now finally today, I'm going to have some time with people who actually understand it well enough so that I can try and get a clue.
Cool. Fraser, can I nudge you to say hi?
Yes, hello, and thank you for including me. So I'm Fraser Scott. I work for a threat modeling vendor. Prior to that, I was doing threat modeling at a financial services organization, so trying to get 10,000 software engineers. Once upon a time, my life was nice and simple, and then I came to an Open Security Summit session and learned about Wardley mapping, and then in a separate session, had my mind completely blown by David Snowden, and I've been on this 3-year rabbit hole where I'm currently reading postmodernist and post-structuralist philosophers, just so I can try and get my head around some of the implications of what I've sort of picked up from the likes of Simon Wardley and Dave Snowden, and trying to understand it in the context of threat modeling and security in general. So yes, thank you for that.
I completely relate to that, man. I've been there. By the way, if you haven't, check out the stuff that Mario Platt has been doing. He has done some great slides and presentations about it. He's also trying to manage.
I chat with him on Twitter every now and again. We sort of, our brains seem to collide every now and again.
Yeah. I did was privileged to join a session with Simon Wardley and Dave Snowden. They did this sort of 2-day thing. So I didn't did everything, all of it, but the bits I was in was amazing. Like these two judo, sort of like black belts, right? Talking to each other. That was really, really cool. And I think we also have Avi, right? Can you nudge in? You're also a heavyweight on these worlds.
Well, I'll jump in to say hi. I won't call myself a heavyweight though. So interesting. I have experience in threat modeling going way back. Izar and Brook and I both worked on the threat modeling manifesto as well. I've been doing threat modeling ever since I had a stint at Microsoft in 2006. So I kind of read the book before that, but that's when I actually started practicing it and doing a lot more. And I do a lot of that now as well. My focus is actually more on more lightweight approaches. Interestingly, completely separate from that, I also use Wardley maps, but not anything to do with threat modeling. I do it more for I'm a consultant. So when I start with a new client, I start by doing a roadmap, understanding their landscape, understanding what security actually means to them, right? Because we'd like to do threat modeling for everything, but it simply doesn't, we don't have the resources to do threat modeling for everything. So where does it make sense to do threat modeling? Where does it make sense to do code review? Where does it make sense to do different things? So I kind of use these for completely different worlds.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I feel that those two worlds, even in my world, are not as merged as they should be, right? So I use threat modeling a lot, so Wordly mapping a lot in the stuff that I do. Is Petra still here? Petra, can you unmute yourself if you can? And because Petra is a good example of, I think you can speak now, Petra, that she's a practitioner. Oh, she can't unmute herself. So she's an amazing individual and she learned a lot. In fact, when I hired her for the first time, part of the reason was she created a threat model and a Wordly map, right? So by then it was already easy. So cool. All right, let's just very quickly, if you're new to Wordly maps.
I am still here.
There you are.
And thank you for the kind words, Dinis. Yeah, I'm also a Wordly maps enthusiast. I'm looking forward to the session. Cool.
So if you're new to Wordly maps or threat modeling, there's been some amazing presentations on the summit that we managed to capture on video. So probably the best place to start if you want to go to the Wordly maps is actually Simon Wardley itself. That is a great session that he done. I highly recommend you to see it. This is one of the best. There's tons of these online, but this is pretty spectacular. This one, Chris did a really cool one on maturity mapping, which actually we'll talk a bit later. That is actually some really cool examples that are very relevant to this. Kat Switel did another great session. So did Chris, which is here, and Petra did a really cool Wordly maps first aid toolkit. So highly recommend that you see these videos. They're all online. When we share the links to this presentation, you can follow, but you can go to the session. If you go to the session for this, for the page for this session, you can see all the links in here. And then on threat modeling, you can basically see that there's also been a lot of really cool sessions, including a session with a lot of the individuals from the threat modeling manifest that we had, but we got one from James, we got one from Avi, which is now here, one from Brook. Again, Brook, you're a common recurrence here, right? And then one from Sebastian, which is, again, a great guy. Actually, was one of the founders or one of the ones who helped organize the first Open Security Summits. And that's also a great session from Threat Modeling Playbook. So, all right. So, Brook, you asked me to add this thought on technique. So, over to you.
All right. Thanks, Denis. So, I just want to talk a little bit about when I think about a technique, what does it got to do? And Jakub or Jacob set me up perfectly here with how do we commoditize this thing? Because I'm of course worried about my clients because I'm consulting these days. And of course, when I worked for a big tech company, I was worried really deeply for my company. You know, I wouldn't work for a company unless I believed in their mission. It's just, you know, I have that luxury. But nevertheless, lately, as I've sort of gone past my building my career phase in my life, I've been worried about the 27 million programmers Evans data estimates are on planet Earth. 27 million. Now, I don't care if that number is 22 million or 32 million. It doesn't really matter. The numbers are big here. That's a lot of people generating code who don't work for companies that have reasonably mature software security programs. And so what you said, Jakub, about commoditizing, how can we make this stuff doable? Is it accessible? Will it be something somebody understands and will do? Will they do it? Is it easy? I'm really concerned about that. So I go into this education that you all are going to give me about Wardley mapping with that mental filter. Let me talk a little bit about views, just a shade. One of the things that has preoccupied me for since about 2002 is what is this thing called security architecture, which means what is this thing called architecture? And I'll tell you something. We humans, we know we've been doing architecture. We've probably been doing it longer than that, but we know we've been doing architecture since at least the Egyptian pyramids. Why? Because we have their drawings. We have their drawings. We know they were drawing architectures, right? And we have the drawings and we have a little bit of writing about what they thought about that and why they made drawings. And so this is old. This is really old in human terms. Maybe, I mean, maybe not old in geospatial terms or cosmos terms, but old for humans, several thousand years at least, that we make views of things that are too complicated to understand just all by themselves, just thinking about them and holding them in our head. The thing is, views are an abstraction. Therefore, they always elide or remove a great deal of detail. That's the point. But that's also the horror or the difficulty. And I think Dinis is going to show us a whole bunch of things that removed too much or showed too much. In fact, in my first solo book, Securing Systems, not that I'm selling books here, I'm not, but just, you know, it's in there. I actually took one of the architectures and slapped on too much detail, just as a point of what happens when you put too much detail on a diagram. My eyes glaze over. I can't deal. So, you know, that's something we have to understand, that often our views, by their very design, if you will, are you know, poor. So, you know, in this storm, I'm looking for any technique in the storm, but it's got to be something that's going to get done. And the learning of it has to be greater than the fairly rapid return of value. Otherwise, only experts are going to be looking at it. And while we do need experts, I do believe that. I'm going to go back to what Jakub said. How can we commoditize this? How can we make this something that everybody just naturally does as part of what they do? They don't have to do it expert level, but I want them to do something. So that's kind of how I'm going to filter and think about everything I learn and hear today is, can people learn this quick? And so thank you very much for letting me kind of set my own personal stage and share that with folks. I hope that's useful.
Cool. Any comments on this?
I've got just one quick comment. When I teach anything, I try to keep it super simple. So I can tell you, Brook, that you can actually teach basics of Wardley maps in like 3 slides in 30 seconds. I do it on one of my threat modeling workshops at one executive MBA studies here in Poland. So like 3 slides, 20 seconds each, and the audience get an understanding of Wardley maps basically. and how to apply them in the AppSec context and threat modeling.
I'm going to learn Polish just to come and take the class.
Cool. So just a couple of little things on what you said. I think the scalability is the key here. In fact, there was already 2 sessions today on the summit that I highly recommend you guys take a look at it. The first one was a really cool open source tool that kind of builds on top of Neo4j, or basically it's a graph, which is a way to scale a lot of connections. And the second one was even more interesting, which was all about the challenges of creating diagrams as code. And I do feel that for this to scale, for the threat modeling and for the Wardley maps to scale, one of the biggest challenges I still feel is that we're still creating them by hand. The only way this will eventually scale is that if you have native creation of Wardley maps and threat models, where you actually have threat models of threat models, actually, not that, sorry. You have different layers of visibility where you have the uber one and then the smaller ones and then the smaller ones, and you zoom in and out depending on context. But the only way we can do that is if we move away from this idea that our threat models or our Wardley maps are kind of static, and they really need to be fed with real data, right? That's the key thing. And Brooke, no, not Brooke, sorry. Who raised his hand? Chris, yeah.
Chris, so from the Wardley mapping perspective, that might be a little bit difficult to achieve. This is certainly possible for technical and technological components. If you have good architectural diagrams or software or architecture as a code solutions, that will certainly work. But what about practices and other stuff? This changes quite a lot. This is intangible component, and it's.
It is, but we're not even getting to the first part, right?
Okay,
like,
fine.
Think about it. Like, we don't even have the basic Wardley maps, right? Like the thing that's amazing about Wardley mapping, again, I couldn't say enough. Just go and read the book, buy the book from Amazon, read it online, just see the stuff. Because what Simon did is he didn't just do the maps, and that was just amazing. If all that Simon did was come up with the Wardley maps and said, here it is, that would be spectacular. But if you look at what he then built on top of it, that's the sweet spot. Actually, but my frustration is I very rarely get to do those parts because I can't even automate and get the practice of the initial bits properly done, get good data so we can look at the practice, so we can measure it, so we can visualize it, so we can see the evolution in the map, right?
It's actually a good idea to explain what are we talking about when we discuss Wardley maps and threat models, because we can do 3 things with Wardley mapping and threat modeling, right? We can use Wardley maps to up our game in the AppSec program and implement threat modeling in the right place of the process, or join it with the right components, right? The right activities. Second thing that we can do with Wardley maps and threat models is map the methodology, the process that we're following for threat modeling, and up our game there. And we can do the third thing, which I think we're discussing today, is start a new way of threat modeling where we add axis and Wardley maps notation for threat modeling, right?
Yes, and you're spot on. So I actually think it's important to contextualize this conversation. We should focus on the third one. So this is not about basically applying Wardley mapping to a practice like threat model in the same way that you can apply Wardley mapping to other practices. So there's a lot of great value that we can do that. I actually think is the third one, Jacob, that you talk about that I think is very interesting, which is how can we apply the threat modeling concepts and practices into a threat model to make the threat model a lot more effective, a lot more useful in an organization.
Yep.
And then there's an interesting element here, which is at the moment, for example, I found a good way, and there's a lot of companies, and Fraser, for example, had this in maybe you can share a little bit of your experience, but there's a lot of companies who have found good ways to make sure that every team does a threat model. It's almost an evolution. As you evolve the practice in the company, there's a moment where threat model is not just done by the security team, it's done by the teams, by the security champions, by the developers, by because it became a practice, becomes something that is actually part of the CI pipeline, and then you mandate it, so you don't have anything that goes live, you don't have anything that gets pushed without the thread model. So the beauty of that is that we already know a good place to put thread modeling creation, and if you can align Wardley maps to that, you certainly have a great way to actually get word map creation in an organization.
I feel like I should respond because you name dropped me. So I think there's quite a few dimensions to this. And again, I think as what was just said, we can decide on where to focus this conversation. The Wardley mapping has been very helpful for me from a product point of view, because it's helped me break down a threat modeling tool into different components and then look at which of those components are commodity, which of those are we sort of custom building, and which of those bits are very much Genesis. But it's Wardley maps also been useful when looking at I think what you're talking about, Dinis, is like an overall program within a large organization about where the various bits of maturity are. If you're running around building custom architectures, then trying to commoditize threat modeling might not be the right time. Like if what you're looking to do at that point is move one aspect of it, architecture, to the right, for example, commoditize that, and then build on top of that with DevOps and all that jazz, and then making sure that your threat modeling practices are aligned to the right levels of maturity in the right way within the organization. So if your organization has annual threat modeling requirements and big long architectural review processes, you're probably not going to be thinking about threat modeling as code. So Wardley mapping for me helps understand the context and the environment of the organization. And then finally, I found Wardley mapping and threat modeling useful because you can think of, when we talk about Wardley maps, we often draw the value chain for a particular user and the different components and different technologies that make up that value chain, and we visualize those across the maturity scale. You can also do that from the perspective of an attacker. So what's the value chain for me as an attacker against an organization? That also has different levels of maturity. So you can hire DDoS as a service, or you can write a completely custom exploit against an attack nobody's ever thought of. And when you bring those two together, the evolution access of the technology you're defending versus the evolutionary access of the sort of attacks and techniques, you get an interesting sort of grid of why are we trying to defend a Genesis threat against a commodity component with a WAF. Now, WAF's not going to be able to, or maybe or not, is not going to be able to protect a particular type of commodity component against a very sort of Genesis or a custom threat. So I think Wardley mapping helps that angle as well. So it's interesting. I'm not quite sure how I feel about trying to give space meaning in a threat model. I think that's an interesting thing worth exploring more, but I've never thought about that and never really sort of.
Well, that's going to be one of the big topics I want to go into next,
yeah.
Right? Because I think actually that's the gap. But the example that you mentioned, I think, is spot on, because we see an attack tree, right? You do this, you do that, and then you start to map the threat agents and the people around it, but we don't put context into it. So, and I think that's the gap. It's a gap because there's a lot of metadata, there's a lot of information that we can capture. And your example of, are we protecting the right thing? Are we investing in the right place? The more we can put context into these maps, the more it becomes obvious where that problem is. The more it becomes, you start to say, well, I should be defending stuff on the left, not on the right. I should be defending stuff over here. And I think that's the key. So cool. Well, let's look at some examples on this, right? So if we have, let's look at some graphs, right? And I'm saying, so I'm being cheeky here, right? But I'm saying, that threat models are graphs. So if you look at this, so this is whatever I said, this is a typical threat model that we tend to do a lot, right? The problem with this is that this is a graph, not a map. Now, for the threat modeling, so for the Wardley maps experts in here, can you guys explain why this is not a map? It's a graph.
So, I mean, I don't try to be an expert, but you need to be very precise because this is not a map according to Simon Wardley, because Simon has a very specific definition of a map. And it should have 6 attributes, one of which is the meaning that the space has a meaning, which means that if you move a component or anything on a diagram, it means that the meaning of the diagram will change. And in this particular situation, if you move, for example, admin service right, left, top or down, nothing changes because it's a graph.
Yeah, absolutely right.
From trust boundaries.
If you cross bound, fine, yeah. But until you cross boundaries, it's the same stuff, the same space. So it's not. That's why I'm very precise that this is Simon's Wardley definition. Because if you are a geek or a math person, then map has a completely different meaning, and it doesn't. And this is a map in that sense.
Well, okay, fair enough. Now I like Simon's definition, so we can go with that. But that's the challenge, right? If you look at this, the problem I have with this, when we, and problem is probably a strong word, but it's that we're losing a huge amount of context because it doesn't, actually Peter just added a good point, right? It doesn't show current position, location. So it's important to understand where these things are. It's important to understand the difference between that and that, right? So the irony here is location actually matters a bit, but we don't enforce it. Because actually, if you think about it, you already have a certain degree of location, because I could do it like this, right? If I said that this is the outside world and that's the inside world, you already have a location, but we don't make it explicit. And we don't, but then again, is this guy? Is this guy, kind of there? In fact, what we do is, it's almost these are our lines, which is our sort of our maturity models on this. And one of the things that would be very interesting with this diagram, for example, is to think about what if I took this diagram and actually map it according to the normal Wardley maps, for example, of how well protected they are, or how exposed, or what is the risk level, or what's the type of vulnerabilities that you have, you get a much better sense of the risk of this flow.
Yeah, but I do feel that there are limits, I think, to what you can achieve with trying to map threat models in a Wardley map, and especially if you have a diagram that is already on this detailed level. I'm not that convinced that putting it in a Wardley map, so adding meaning to the location, will provide you a lot of more context. But the value of Wardley mapping is, especially if you have less details than this, so you more have a conceptual architecture, or you just start with mapping what you have in your organization. You have no clue where to start with threat modeling. So you run into the scalability problem, the resourcing problem. That's where I think Wardley maps can have a huge advantage, because it can quickly identify hotspots. If you're already on this detailed level, you might as well go with the boundaries that are there, because, as you said, they already give you some sense of location or meaning or whatever. And trying to put this in a Wardley map, first of all, it probably won't make it more easy to read. So you lose something on that part. And I'm doubting if the information that you gain from that new context really gives you new insights. But like I said, maybe I'm wrong.
Well, okay, let's keep exploring, because I think this is a good example, right? So can you see how this is just about that? Right, I just took the main boxes, right? You got the order client there. You've got, it's basically, I just followed the lines to create the stuff on the left. And I could have basically added the trust boundary. So I could even say there's a trust boundary there, and then there's probably another trust boundary here, and there's another one there, right? But can you see that the main one, is very equivalent to the graph on the right, all I did was anchor the client at the top.
Mhm.
So can you see it? So basically, that what all I done here was to basically say, if I follow the line here, you got the client is here, the client is talking to another service, who talks to a node service, who goes to an S3 bucket, who talks to an agent, who has another service that talks to another API, for example, right? So all I did was take the map, the graph on the left, and just order it based on an anchor, which is what I have at the top. In this case, my anchor is the client.
And Dinis, what does that actually, in this context, without doing anything else, does that help that you anchored by the client?
Well, you could pick. So again, you could pick, and this is the interesting thing, right? You could choose what size, where do you want to see your world from? So what I like about the anchor is basically saying, I'm going to go from here to X. I'm going to start to looking at this from the point of view of the of the client, but you can do the same thing from the point of view of the auth service. You can do the same thing from the point of view of the user DB. And this is why we ultimately need to be able to do this programmatically, because you can do this if you are doing it manually, if you're manually creating all of this stuff.
But Dinis, first of all, yeah, you can do that programmatically, like things that depend on dots or other stuff like that. You can set an anchor and have the thing reordered. But then again, the question is, I present this to a team. The fact that they're looking at the client or the fact that they are looking at the other API, how does that impact their understanding of what's being represented so that they can derive threats out of it?
Okay, well, let's explore that. But first of all, you already mentioned a very key point, which is when we present something to a team, and this is where it's very powerful to be able to do this programmatically, you need to represent in context to what that team knows about or cares about. So, and that's why, I always found that with threat models, you need to be able to pivot. Where is the center of gravity? Where is your anchor? Because your anchor should be whoever you're talking to, unless you're looking at end-to-end systems, right, at that level. But let's now look at this example. So I guess first of all, just make sure we're on the same page here. Can you guys see the connection between this one here and that one there?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It's a reordered anchor.
Cool. Now, the problem with the one on the left at the moment still is that it's still a graph. It's not a map. And so let me ask a simple question. Which one of these I'm going to protect?
How do you mean protect?
Well, so I only have a limited security budget, right? I only have a limited amount of time and effort. I need to focus. Which ones should the teams spend their sprints, and which ones should they work on improving the security, for example, or even which ones I should be worried about versus others?
Okay, and that's exactly what I meant with what a Wardley map can do for you. What I did, and I think the vertical axis, so your viewpoint, your anchor point, and everything down there is not that important. What I think is the most important axis in the Wardley map is the horizontal axis, because that gives you evolution. And evolution is a really broad description.
Yeah.
But the one that I pick for threat models is certainty. How much certainty do you have about a certain element?
Yeah.
And for example, every SaaS service that's highly standardized, it's properly documented. Usually, there's not a lot you can customize on that. So I put those things completely on the right. So in evolutionary status, everything that is as a service that you just buy and use and have zero influence on and need to file a request for changes to have anything fixed. That's what stuff that I put on the right. Stuff that is fully customized, that we actually build ourselves, and even where we might even be starting with currently, that's typically on the left. I put all those elements in the Wardley map, and I just draw the connections as in the graph. And for the vertical axis, what I try to do is put criticality in there. So the higher it is, the more critical that system is, or the more valuable that system is for me.
But then
And
you can map this to each of these, right? Because
Yeah.
I can create a Wardley map for each of those sort of metrics.
yeah, sure. But
So-
if you take these two axes, so criticality and certainty, that means
Yeah.
that the stuff in the upper left side that is highly critical and you have very little certainty on, that's
Mhm.
probably the components where you should put the most effort in researching the first.
I agree.
And the stuff
But
in the down right side, so a lot of certainty, not critical, you can probably safely ignore for now at least, or do some lightweight threat modeling, but that's probably not where your hotspot is.
you're doing a map there, right? So you're doing
Yeah.
a map where you are moving the boxes around to give you context.
Mhm.
So if you look at the difference between A and B, and InfoSec Crow, right? Just make a comment that says, "Call me crazy, but I want my assets to reflect pets." That's a great example, right? If you look at B here, right? The difference between A and B is I map my pet versus castle
Yeah.
in the Wardley map. So now you can start to see that which is the ones that I should focus on and what's the ones I worry about, right? And then in movement, what we want is to go like that, right? I want to say, hey, let's do this as strategy, but this focus is not obvious when I look at this. And it's very easy to look at the big one and then going, oh, okay, I need to fix this, I need to address this, but not understanding that, for example, if these ones on the left are pets, which in this case could be that one, and for example, I don't know, that one, it means that, any fix there is going to take ages. Anything that you want to change it is going to be a massive problem, where other systems might not be a problem. So, and sometimes it's easy to, without this context, not to see that visibility.
Dinis, hold on for a second here. I'm going to have to play the explaining like I'm 5, because you guys are running in all kinds of directions, and I think that it may be moving a bit too fast for a lot of people in the audience, including me. So all of a sudden we are talking cattle and pets and whatnots, and discovering which asset is the most valuable. And I think that there's a lot of you guys know the structure and the implicit understanding of a Wardley map. Many of us around here don't. Can you take one step back and go back to that and explain that pet thing and cattle and how you're figuring out which asset is the one to touch? Because
Okay.
All of a sudden I see us assuming value from the positioning of a thing in the map. But if I
Okay.
don't understand how the map works, it gets harder.
Shall I
Okay.
explain the pet versus cattle
Yes.
thing then?
Yep.
Pets versus cattle is a terminology that comes from the DevOps movement, and the idea behind continuous delivery and especially automated provisioning is that your servers lose special meaning, and they're just assets. They can easily be replaced. And what they use as an analogy to show why that is important is the pets versus cattle. So typically, if you look at old data centers, you see that servers have a special name. If servers break down, people try to fix that. They log into the machine, they run manual updates, they manually change config files. So they treat them as a pet. And I don't like the pets versus cattle. I think a classic car versus rental car is a better analogy. If you have a classic car, you try whatever you can to keep that running. And if at some point in time something breaks, for example, your wipers, you simply accept that you cannot drive in the rain anymore. And that's fine because you love your car, you want to keep it, despite everything that's wrong with it. If you take a rental car, you just want it to work and you want it to be exactly as you specified. And the moment you're not happy with it anymore, you give it back to the company and say, I want a new rental car. And so the rental cars are completely interchangeable. So pets versus cattle means pets is something you care about, something you put a lot of time and effort and care and love into to keep it alive. Cattle is, and that's what I like, but cattle is disposable. Okay? If you don't like the cattle anymore, you can simply get rid of it, get a new one, and go on with your business, like a rental.
Thank you. In
So-
the name of cattle everywhere, I take exception.
Okay, so if you put that concept into a Wardley map, and Wardley map space has meaning, so left to right means higher stages of evolution. Stuff on the left is new, is genesis, is stuff you're just getting experience with. Stuff on the right is stuff that has been around for quite some time, standardized, you can get as a service. If you put pets versus cattle on that axis, pets are typically on the left-hand side. That's the stuff that you deeply care about and need a lot of maintenance. There's a high level of uncertainty, and you can have some discussion about that. But cattle, stuff that is fully interchangeable, that is typically on the right. The thing is that most pet systems actually are quite old, are very well known and described because of all the stuff that has been going wrong in the past. So if that is really genesis, you can have a discussion about. But from a maintenance point of view, it's certainly stuff that should be on the left-hand side.
Thank you very much.
So if you look at this, in terms of your world, this part here will be a server that you maintain. This will be an EC2 instance or an instance that is disposable, that is built on demand, that is created as part of a CI pipeline and is disposable after a couple of hours. So that's the world where, well, the idea of cattle is because cattle is more disposable, right? You can just, it grows up, but is that disposability of, in fact, if you want to think from compute is a good example, right? If the difference is, do you have a custom built server that you put it together, that you maintain, or you have a complete disposable infrastructure that gets spun up on and off and you don't have to worry about it? Okay. That's the logic. So when you go back to that example, the interesting question is whether the servers that we're dealing with, or the part of the elements of the thread model, where are they? So I think Louis was saying that if you can actually, by the way, the other thing that Wardley, this is where Simon is amazing, right? Because you can expand on this. So if you look at this, right, because I think sometimes we get through hang on Genesis, custom, product, and commodity, right? Because if you really look at this, it can be unmodel, divergent, convergent, and model, right? It could be novel, emerging, good, best. Can you see that? It can be concept, hypothesis, theory, universally accepted. So the way I think about the Wardley maps is that you fundamentally have, you have two elements, right? You have the element of the chain, this needs this, needs this, needs. So basically the dependency graph, whatever, which is basically one is connected to the other from a higher level of abstraction to a lower level of abstraction, which is the top and bottom. So you got that, and that's basically this line here. And then from left to right, you have an evolution. You have a state change. You go from one state to the other. But as we just mentioned before, the state change could be low risk. You can have a Wardley map that goes from low risk to high risk. In fact, I actually think I have a cool example here, because usually we talk about the cup of tea, right? So usually, the typical Wardley map is this cup of tea here, right? Where you go from this, which can be a thread model, right? If you think about it, you go from here, which is, I need this, who need that, who need this. Actually, so this is not a cup of tea, this is a website, but same thing. Customer needs this, website, CRM, etc., compute, etc. So that's kind of the example. And then when you apply the Wardley map on it, you now see the difference between stuff that is Genesis, custom build, product, and commodity.
Dinis, may I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, sure.
So with those four categories, what is also extremely important is that the commodity is very well defined and understood. So it means it has the best security practices around it already built and explored. Whereas things on the left-hand side, Genesis and custom build, are highly unpredictable, and you cannot really prove them from anything because this stuff is too new and too untested out there in the market. So that, I think, also dictates how we should approach those components, because in terms of the right-hand side components, you want to adopt best practices. And in terms of the left-hand side components, you want to build some kind of preventive measures around the components to figure out when they are breached and to limit the scope of the breach.
Yeah, but you just said something that I want to challenge you a little bit, which is you could have a model that looks like this, right? I'm trying
Yep.
to make the same one. This is from the usability point of view, right? So
Yep.
this is from a practicality point of view. I can, as a consumer, I can access them like this, right? So I can experience as a consumer like this. But I could draw the same thing where this is highly risk, zero security, and this is highly secure, right? Basically, maximum security, right? And you could have this situation. You could actually have a situation where the one that is the bigger commodity is the one that is the most vulnerable.
True, but it also has the best practices around it. So we
Well,
should be able to mitigate
but it
that
depends which angle
vulnerability.
you look at it, right? That's
Yeah.
the thing. So the thing about the commodity is the commodity based on a particular element. So it's a commodity is one that it behaves like a commodity, right? It's used on demand, up and down. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the most mature for example, from a security point of view. It could usually they go hand in hand, but not always.
Yeah, that's I can agree with.
So one of the examples I have here, which I think is probably interesting, that I apologize because this is done on paper, right? But I think it kind of shows the thinking. If you look in the left, actually it's probably better if I first let me just hide this guy quickly, right? So if you look at this part here, where on the left, what I've mapped was an instance response. And I know you don't know, you can't read my handwriting, but I tell you what it is. This is the metrics. This is Git on the left here. This is AWS. This is an alert, etc. So what we mapped here was how we handle a security incident, right? And what you see here in the beginning is all of these went to kind of an email inbox, which was somebody taking a look at it. You require a human to take a look at it. And that person might actually do an AWS code, which then fix on AWS. So that's the practice that we had. What I then do with this is I basically said, actually what we want to do is this is the evolution of that process, where now you took all those signals and we now actually have an inbox that had a bunch of alerts already here. And then we put on a Jira workflow that was improving, that then eventually went to the human who did some stuff. But even that, we already want to do some stuff automatically. So you start to understand better the flows of how everything fits together. And you start to understand the risks and what risks you actually have with each of these bits in place. But let's go back to the previous topic, because I think, so Louis, sorry, let me just clear this up. So if I go back to that example that we were talking about, which is basically this one here, and I think that this is like the big sort of punchline that I feel that is interesting for us to talk about is that when you take this, which is basically a typical threat model, and you create, something that looks like that, which is a typical graph, what kind of analysis we can now do on this, where we use a threat modeling context to allow us to make good decisions. Where the space matters, where the way you then look at this is that if I then create Wardley maps from the original threat model, which fundamentally allows me to define, so somebody was talking about, for example, risk components. So again, if I put high risk here and low risk here, and remember that we get to define what that means, right? So high risk might be no security, no visibility, no logs, no kind of understanding what's going on, not ability to patch, all sorts of metrics that you can grab. Again, if you draw the same diagram, in the same way, you start to get a sense for where you need to focus on.
So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a quick comment here that it becomes tricky because we need to be consistent with technically any other threat modeling methodology or any other way of describing what is the risk to this business, right? So we can take the very same system, go with, you know, even Stride, RTMP or whatever. For example, RTMP will focus on data stores, right? We will come up with that our focus should be on critical assets, right? So if you suggest that the low risk or high risk will be on the left or the right, it means that it automatically means that the very same systems that we believe that are critical and worth to investigate, worth to model the threats and apply mitigations will land, you know, either here or here, which very much limits the way we're thinking about the x-axis.
Well, but you get to define what x-axis is, right?
Yep, that's right.
So what about if I told you that the x-axis is patching time, right? So here you can patch within 1 hour to 8 hours, right? Here you can patch within 1 day to 2 days. Here you can patch within 7 days. Doesn't matter who asked for it, the thing is not going to go production less than a week. Here you can't patch at all because you don't have the source code, nobody doesn't understand how it works, etc. Right? If I then draw the same map, right? And let's say I said there's one critical vulnerability on every one of these systems. One, right? So which one do you address, right?
So Dinis, that's exactly what I want to put there. The thing that I'm saying here is that the reordering, or rather the sorting that we are doing here, because we are basically taking a graph, applying an ordering function and looking at it in a different way. We are looking from minus to plus, where minus to plus could be basically anything that we decide.
Yeah.
So I see that in a threat modeling context, helping me figuring out, once I have my threats, once I know what needs to be fixed, this could help me figure out what do I do first, because then I have the ordering and the mapping to show me what has more risk, what's more valuable, what can be patched quicker, and with that decides where am I going to put my efforts. What I'm still having a bit of a difficulty here is how does this help me understand threats, illicit threats? Should it at least? Am I seeing it wrong? Like, should this thing help me in any way at that step as well, or are we jumping?
I take a try at this, Izar?
Please.
Because I'm really, I mean, I'm like you, I'm learning here. So forgive me if this is naive or whatever. But I'm thinking it comes into the axis, the axes you choose.
Yep.
This is really critical. As soon as I jettisoned this sort of standard, you know, pet versus cattle or you know, as soon as I jettison that, because while that's important information, it may not, for a threat model, my first or may not be the one I want to go for right away, although it is important ultimately. And I might remind everyone, there is no perfect view. We want to always do multiple views to show us different things.
Yeah.
And that's something Dinis is trying to show us every time he redraws, that other information gets exposed. And you know, Dinis, you didn't say that, but that's what you're doing as near as I can tell. But here's what I'm thinking. If we had an attackability, and that word is not actually a word in English, but I'm just going to make it up because I want to throw in both exposure, weakness, the kinds of things, the kinds of targets that people go after, that attackers typically go after. All of that has to go into that attackability, more attackability, and that's where a little skill in threat modeling and threats happens, right? More attackability. Let's put that on the y-axis, and higher is more attackable, lower is less. And then I'm thinking for the x-axis, the amount of risk, and I know that's a very troublesome term, so maybe what I'm really thinking is something Dinis already said, which is the amount of, you know, stuff we've already got inbuilt or somebody's taking care of, and we know that there's some more controls or more you know, more mature or whatever goes on the x-axis. So anything that shows up very high in this on the left top is immediately prioritized by definition.
So
Right.
Brooke, just look at this in the
Go
middle
on,
and
Dinis.
then continue. What I've done here is I use attackability as the axis. So I go from state sponsor on the left, commercial 1, so commercial 2, commercial 1, script kiddie. That's the attackability, where you go from highly evolved, somebody with a good commercial model, somebody who's making some money, somebody who's just playing around, and then I map the same thing according to those. So what you have here is on the circle on the right, this part here is the ones that you are exposed by a script kiddie. So your attackability is basically which of these systems can today be exploited by somebody without a lot of skills, which also means that we have a lot more script kids. We have a lot more of these low skill attackability than we have of the state sponsored. And the reason why I think this is very important is because what we tend to do a lot in security is we go and we focus on these guys here because we understand, because we feel that it's super important, but then we don't take into account that to exploit that, you need to have...
Those are the rare ones, though, actually. They're dangerous, don't get me wrong. And if you have state-sponsored actors, that's a whole level of assurance. That's a whole nother level, but not everybody has that. Collateral damage, sure, but lots of situations don't.
But does this make sense? Where the attackability in this case is from left to right. So anything that falls into this right column is things that will have a lot more clear and present danger.
Brooke, the parameters that you suggest for the axis choice gives me an idea. So Wardley map is a visualization layer on top of quantitative risk analysis. What do you think about that?
Say it again, because I missed a couple words.
So Wardley map's notation of drawing things with some axis, some parameters, is just visualization layer on top of quantitative risk analysis. And this quantitative risk analysis means that for our business, we have a parameter algorithms that define how much risk is there in a given component, right? So depending on how much it is, the more left or the more right it lands on the Wardley map.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly where my brain is going here. And did I say I wanted to learn something today? I'm there. I think that's exactly what and that's one of the hardest problems in threat modeling is getting people to assess risk properly instead of just using a CVSS, which is terrible, by the way, provably so. Go look at the research. And I'm not killing CVSS. It's very useful for what it was intended for. That's not my point. But nevertheless, that's what most people use, and it's terrible, which is why they keep getting attacked. So, instead of doing that, if we can visualize it, I think that is so powerful because, just the medium, high, low, and the graph and everything, and the 5 highs, that just, it's noise. It doesn't really get to people in the way that you could if you said this component, and here's the reasons why it isn't, thank you.
Sorry.
Jacob, can you write that? Because I think that definition was really good, right? I think that definition of putting a visualization, although I would say that it's more than that, but I think is exactly the kind of thinking that I'm pursuing here, which is Wardley maps allows you to visualize on top of this sort of quantitative data, that real world data that we've created, and then we allow to apply metrics and allow to reorganize it based on some of the parameters that we have. And I think that correlation is super important.
So I feel like I'm on the verge of having my mind blown, like from what Brooke started saying, and this is great discussion, but then I feel like we went sideways a bit because it feels like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now, all the quantitative analysis, quantitative risk, and Dinis, even your x-axis here, that's talking about the threat that we already found. You can't apply that to a specific component. So the attackability that Brooke was talking about, you can't break that down to, okay, what's the actual risk? Because we don't know yet. this
Yeah, but okay,
attackability is
but-
kind of
okay.
amorphous,
Yeah,
and
but
a lot
on
of
that
stuff
one-
needs to go in there. And I think that if we figure what that out is exactly, that's brilliant, but we can't fall down on what the actual risk is. We haven't threat modeled it yet. That's what we're trying to do here, right?
Okay, but
If
you are threat modeling because you will create you create a threat model that has the information that you have available,
Right.
and you map the risks that you understand there. Correct?
But right, but you're trying to figure out, okay, so what is the risk of this component? Well, you don't know until you figure out the threats. So
Well,
who's the attacker? Who's the attacker that could exploit this component? Well, it depends which kind of attacks we're talking about, right? Are we talking about a simple SQL injection, quote, quote, attack? Or are we still talking about some advanced script analysis on the same component?
Yeah,
That
but you
doesn't
can't.
apply.
Yes, but you can't mix layers, right? I think
Right.
the thing about that one is that you have to have a level of consistency. So if you look at, for example, let's say SQL injection, right? Let's say you have 10 SQL injections, right? Which one do you fix first?
That's also what I meant earlier, Avi. I'm not convinced that with a Wardley map you can get a list of threads as you can do, with, for example, with Stride. I mean, if you just have, if you have a map with all sorts of components and you iterate Stride all over them, you get a huge list of threads, and you will not be able to get that same list with Wardley maps. What Wardley maps can do for you is, before you start doing that, identify the hotspots in your architecture based on certainty or attackability or whatever, and afterwards give you a tool where to focus on first in terms of mitigation. So it can help with the scalability problems, and it can help you with defining a risk mitigation strategy. And that's where Wardley maps can give you really quickly insights that are otherwise hard to get. The stuff in between, getting the list of the actual threats, no, I'm not convinced that Wardley mapping can do that for you. But using Wardley maps with that information can make it way more powerful, because you can fix two problems: the problem before that and the problem afterwards.
Can I tag on you, Dave, please? Again, none of these are, and this is a problem I've had in threat modeling for a very long time, and that is very few of what is proposed as threat modeling methods cover the entire universe. Very few of them. And there are a few exceptions. My own attempt, ATASM, at least covers the very top of it, but it doesn't tell you what to do at all. 400 pages later, maybe I've said something about how you actually implement that. But that's kind of all the things you got to touch. And I've tried very hard over many years to try and get at all the stuff you got to touch. But very few of these methods. Stride is a threat gateway, if you will, or gateway drug is what I like to say. It gets you in there, but it's not a method. All the rest of the book tells you what else you got to do. And Wardley Maps is a tool for some things, but again, it's not a method. And we lack a real overarching method. With all due respect to all the people who've done this, I think maybe Adam Shostak's 4 questions is as close as I can get. What are we working on? What do we got? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And have we done enough? That's as close to a method as I've seen, really, that's overarching, that covers everything, and everything else falls short. And that I think is something that I just want to acknowledge. I'm not saying, I'm having my mind blown, so don't get me wrong. I'm loving this, but still, don't mistake the map for the territory, maybe.
I'm just going to channel, sorry, Avi, I'm just going to channel my inner Snowden here. I think it's okay that we don't have a single method. And the point I was kind of trying to share in my diagram thing on the chat earlier is how you threat model a commodity system isn't how you should threat model something in Genesis. And even within an organization, let alone between organizations, how you do that threat modeling, what your processes look like, what methodologies you use, that is entirely contextual. And I think the power of Showstack's 4 questions is because it's not a method, it's a framework. It just provides some basic structure in which to develop or customize a method. And I think that's why you end up having a lot of sort of debates about, well, this is the best method and this is the best method for threat modeling. It's entirely contextual, and we have to be happy with that. Sorry, Abby, your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, no, I just want to refer back to what Dave was saying. I mean, I feel like this goes back to the scope that that we said at the beginning, that Jakub, I'm not trying to pronounce your name, I'm sorry. And I feel like we started talking about those 3 options of how to do threat modeling with Wardley maps. We said that we want to be using the Wardley map for the threat model. And I feel like now we're going back to that first option of finding out what part of the system to do a threat model for, which I love, and I do, and I do that already. But using this for the threat model itself, I feel like we're still going back to trying to analyze the threats here. And I feel like that is what is my small stumbling block before that huge mind blown that I'd like to get past.
Okay, but look at this, right? Actually, can somebody clear? I think who did the other drawing? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was me. That was me. Give me a second.
All right. So if you look at this, right? This is an example of an architecture diagram, right? And Brook was funny. Sometimes it starts like this, right? and then you can get that. But even this, right? Like you got a nice threat model. I think there was one here that talked about. It'd be nice. I think I have one that actually puts the stride on it. If somebody has a good example of a more advanced threat model, be cool. But it's the same thing, right? You take this, and by the way, I'm not saying that Wardley maps replace stride or whatever methodology you're using. I think whatever methodology you're using to create a first list of risks and issues and areas to focus on is great. The question is, which ones matter? And I always find that that's sometimes the challenge you have here is, if you have high risk vulnerabilities left, right, and center here, or you have a bunch of problems, which ones actually matter? And I think if you can use Wardley maps from a thinking of, I need to put an evolution on this, I need to define the metrics that I care that allow me to determine where I have to care about.
I'm also struggling a bit with what Avi is struggling with. How can you use Wardley mapping to actually do the threat modeling itself? And one of the things that I can come up with is that you can prioritize the different types of threats where to focus on. For example, if you have something that is a commodity, you probably should worry mostly about threats in the availability category and less in the spoofing and integrity category, because you can assume that if that is a big commercial service, they have stuff in place to prevent that. Availability, from your point of view, is probably the stuff that you have to worry about the most. Look at what's happening when AWS goes down. Your system is gone, basically. If you're using that, that should be your primary focus. Stuff in Genesis, well, that's probably things that availability is not the key element there, because it's still early. You're still trying stuff out. You probably were more worried about things like integrity there. Is my system stable enough or reliable enough to actually use for anything? So that's how you could use Wardley mapping in the threat model, the hardcore threat modeling phase, maybe to prioritize the types of threats that you iterate over, maybe. But it's a stretch.
The thing I would add is that when you look at it security from a holistic point of view, it's important to understand all the key elements of that are at play. So, for example, do you have a team on the other side? Do you understand the systems? Do you have automated CI pipelines? Do you have a way to test the situation? All of those matter when you focus on what to fix first, what you can do about it, what you can't do about it. And those are maturity things that you can measure, and you can understand, you know, where are you in the scheme of things that allow you then to say how much effort you need to put to get that thing fixed.
May I jump in here and share a screen for a second?
Yeah.
Because there's an old map in the community forum that I hope you haven't seen yet, but this is an example of using Wardley map, a map to analyze. I don't know if this is a threat analysis, but essentially to try to establish some sort of security in a particular company or a space. And we have on the top cyber attack, which is going to happen. All the black dots are components which attackers have to have in place in order to launch a cyber attack. And the white dots are things things and systems which are under your company control. Right. So those are the things that are part of your, in this case, infrastructure. So what you get here, you get components which are on the right-hand side in the commodity space. And for the things in the commodity space, just as Dave said, and Dinis, I think you said it earlier, you have to adopt best practices, because best practices are the cheapest possible, perhaps not the cheapest possible. Best practices, or the lack of best practices, is the easiest to exploit for the attacker to get into the system. So if you don't follow the best practices, you are leaving plenty of vulnerabilities which are very easy to exploit for the external attacker. This is what you want to close. Things on the left-hand side, or the more you move to the left-hand side, they are more unpredictable. And if they are more unpredictable and less people knows how they work, then it means that for you, it will take a lot of effort to secure them or to prevent any threat or from materializing for those components. That's why I would say you have to build some sort of protection around those components without really tackling them. But since this is uncertain and the knowledge about those components isn't spread in the market, chances that attackers will exploit those components are rather low, because attackers will have to penetrate the system first, figure out what components do you have, and because they are custom, there is no external knowledge out there, they will have to find a way to make a breach in one way or another. So this is very expensive for them.
Chris, can I intersect something here? Just
yeah.
Quickly. What's bothering me here is that you're bringing a great case, you're showing a great example here, but in your explanation, I am hearing so much inferred information that is not present in the graph itself. Like I keep thinking to myself, if I take a graph like this and I go show to, for the lack of a better name, decision makers, chances are that there's going to be violence. Because they're not going to follow the whole tail. They're not going to extract the same information off of it.
So let me address that straight away. The whole concept of Wardley mapping is that it gives you, of course, the visual communication, stuff like that, but it gives you language to operate in a particular way. So those components, Genesis, custom, product, and commodity, they have a very strict definitions and a set of associated attributes. That's why when I see something in the commodity space, I get a lot of associated verbs, actions, descriptions with those network components, and a lot of assumptions about the knowledge which is out there in the market. If I see custom, that also means that this is custom, there is no knowledge in the market, it's highly unpredictable, etc., etc. If you want to present something like this to an audience which doesn't know Wardley mapping, it may get really difficult, and you have to explain all those things that I'm talking about, or forget about the map and tell them a nice story.
Izar, you should treat Wardley maps like logging out that comes out of your tools. You also don't present that to the decision makers. It's information you use to come to a conclusion, and Wardley maps should be used the same way.
Right. Yeah, I'm starting to see that clearly now. Thank you.
But the fact that you can challenge is part of what's important. The fact that somebody can say, why are you saying my network devices over there? Why are you saying my vulnerability, exploitability over here? That is also part of the power, because then you make sure that you're all in the same boat. Make sure, so you get to define how you read this. And then once you can agree on how you're reading it, what's your definition of Genesis, custom, product, and commodity, or what lenses you're seeing this, then you have context. So what you can see here on those lines, test and remediate, resilience and capacity, what Tony's representing here is what are the actions they can take. So they could say, look, we're going to test and remediate on those items in red because we have vulnerabilities, we need to fix it. We're going to add resilience to those areas in blue, and we're just going to add capacity so we can scale at that level.
So the arrows there, they are the end action of what you're proposing from reading this particular map.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And is that part of every Wardley map? Every Wardley map ends up with arrows saying, this is what we're going to do to these particular things? Or is this an extension?
Let me share one thing here. Go on, Chris.
So that's interesting because those arrows, they are standardized to some extent, but essentially every map has those actions described in a different way.
Yeah. So look, let me show a bunch of different examples, right? Here is cloud security DevOps, where you're mapping where things are going. So you could see the areas. Here is that one. So this is on that presentation. Here is one where you're topping the domain knowledge on the different areas here. Here's one, this is a really cool one where you're actually mapping the SOC activity, where you can start to see the different elements from actuators, analytics, sort of respond, detect, and identify, right? And you can start to map this. And you can then add areas here. You can then say, this is where we are, this is where we need to be. Then you have other ways, like, for example, so one other practice is to put something like this, which shows attrition. So you know that it's very hard to go from there to there. So you can have attrition. And again, like here, you could say, where's my strategy, right? Malware strategy, host OS, AV knowledge. So you can start to map the different elements of this. And then I think I had some auto generation. One of the ones that you might also find interesting is the GDPR ones. Yeah, so this is a really cool one where what you actually had here was a GDPR analysis of where we were before and what we wanted to improve in our GDPR processes. So we mapped the maturity of the things that we needed to do in order to be GDPR compliant, and then we said what we want to evolve. A variation is GDPR. So you can see that we started here and we arrived here, for example, from a point of view. And then another variation is PC audit. So we started PC audit here, and then as we evolve, as we build process. So in this particular example, we put so much stuff into Jira and automation, everything there, that we just sat down the auditor in front of Jira, and 3 days later, he was complete of a 5-day audit because everything was mapped. We connected the dots. We commoditized a lot of the activities in this example.
Okay, so again, what the arrows show. Now, what are the bubbles?
So the bubbles in this particular case I think that's just an example on this. That's the storage that we have. But you can actually see the legend here, right? You got tasks, to-dos, and etc. The thing about this is you can define that. So I feel that it's about what story do you want to communicate. And you can then use the fact that you can add attributes, the fact that space matter, the fact that you can group things. That's the important thing. So Jacob,
now we are moving from a sorting function to basically a transformation on the data that you already know to express a reality in different terms, in terms that are by themselves ordered.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay.
Yeah, I see stuff like arrows and areas and colors like punctuation. Yeah? So they don't actually change the text, they just make it more readable. They help you tell the story better. And I'm always quite liberal with adding that kind of stuff because it's certainly not explicitly defined in the Wardley maps. Yeah? So whatever I think is valuable to keep on the picture to make the story more clear or to help me remind what we discussed or concluded in the past, I just add to the map. That's also the pitfall of Wardley mapping. If you go overboard, you end up with a huge mess that is totally unreadable 2 weeks later.
Got it.
Yeah, so there's some really good stuff that we've done here, right? Actually done by some really, great guys. And one of the things that we've done here was, let me see if I find an example, was when we mapped the multiple elements of this. And so here's an example of where we were capturing one of our tools, and we were basically defining what we need in order to understand and what we need to create, and the maturity of the initial bits, and what we need to what's the challenge, what we need to do, how we need to think about this. So see, so here, right? So this is actually from a business point of view. This is what actually, that's just I think there was a better one here, where I think so this is one where, again, you can look at the bits that you want to address and then map a strategy around it, and what you want to do, what you want to focus, what you want. So in this case, what you want to move forward. And this was a great way of thinking about the solution that we have and the strategy that we create. So yeah, so this is, and actually, I remember this one. So this was like, we can use a Wardley map, right, to then define what we want to do. And actually, so I remember the challenge here that I was saying is that, for example, I want to map where we are according to this. So the question was, for example, you could say you have a CI/CD pipeline here, but if we are today, so I was saying, like, if we are today over there, then I want to see it on my map, not where the industry is, but where we are. So then you could see what you need to evolve from an industry point of view. So, but I think the key idea here, right, is that if you go back all the way to the beginning, threat models are great at finding risks, are great at finding vulnerabilities, are great at mapping reality, but they tend to give us a graph that, I don't think it fulfills the potential of the data that we have collected. So I think if you apply Wardley maps on top, i.e. you apply the concept of access, the concept of location, the concept of movement, the concept of context of how you're looking at, you can then do a whole number of other analysis, and actually you can make much better decisions because you can base yourself based on facts, not based on something that you can measure here, but you don't have the whole picture.
Yeah, but be careful with details, because just like maps that you use to navigate in the real world, you have to decide on a scale and how much detail you can put on that scale. I mean, if you make a map of the world, it's pointless to try to get all the street names in there. It's not going to work.
Yeah, exactly.
And from another point of view, don't fixate too much on being accurate. You can navigate perfectly with a relatively abstract map of your country. You don't need to have every corner of a highway on that map if you just want to navigate from city to city. So that's also how you need to get some experience with Wardley mapping. Detail level is important. I'd like to be confidently wrong. Yeah, okay. Exactly, but that's the point. As long as you understand which limitations you are working with, it's fine to put that in a relatively abstract model, as long as it still provides you new insights, new context. And that's the whole point of Wardley map.
But here's something interesting, right? And this is where I think security can bring a lot of value even to the normal mapping, which is, in security, we also work a lot with good data. I know sometimes we don't, but on the other hand, we have lots of very accurate data. So for example, when an incident occurs, you have evidence that this just became reality. You have evidence that A can go to B, can go to C, can go to F, right? And then you can jump to N if that's the case. So I actually think that security, when you can apply and have feedback loops that challenge it, you actually can start to have very good data compared to what you know today. And in fact, even that, it's an interesting to map, because I like the idea, for example, that I can take a bunch of threats, a bunch of risks, and I can ask a simple question: how much data do I have to support each of those? And you might find that a lot of the times, nobody has good data. You just have a hint. You think, well, this could be problematic. It might not be. In fact, the biggest problem I have with risk mappings, especially when you start to put metrics on it and you start to define costs, etc., is that I would challenge to say it has to be supported by data. And by now, if you have the last 10 years of data in the company, show me the evidence to show why this is more high risk than that. And a lot of time you don't have that in risks.
Good point.
Yeah, I've spent half my career trying to explain that in business terms, and that you're right. It's one of the biggest problems is we spend a lot of time, and a lot of time we don't have the right data. This is really critical. A lot of times we're holding up the wrong data and saying, see, and it's either it's not relevant or it's not a good measure. This is one of the bigger problems that we have, and that's a whole presentation right there.
But Brook, what about this? If you have a graph of tons of risks, right? This risk is caused by those risks, caused by those risks, caused by that, right? And I ask a simple question: can you sort them from left to right on your level of confidence of where you got that risk from? Whether it's a guess to I have data because this happened 100 times. You do that, and immediately you see which ones you might be completely off and which ones you have real data. And then you ask.
Generally, I try not to guess, by the way. That's what people pay me for, right? And one of the things that I think has been one of our bugaboos in security is, I said it because I know. And actually, that's the worst measure, because your risk tolerance, Denis's risk tolerance, my risk tolerance is not what's relevant here. What's relevant is the organization's risk tolerance and what they're willing to do. And that's like the first shift, mentally. But yeah, and coming up with those, as someone who has proposed risk measurements in the absence of actuarial tables and decent probabilities, I kind of live in this space, but again, I try not to guess. On the other hand, guesses, you're right. Spreading them out from, I've got hard data here, to, what's the one thing we know? Just everybody, what's the one thing we know with certainty? You stick a host, whether it's virtual or not, on the internet with a routable address, and we know with certainty, 100% certainty, it will get probed. I didn't say compromised. If it's hardened, maybe it can protect itself. If it's just the default, I guarantee you between 17 seconds and 8 hours, it will be compromised. That's the one thing we know, 100%. We shouldn't argue about that one.
But I have to slightly disagree here. I think a lot of companies are using the finger in the wind method to define key risks, or at least answer the questionnaires in frameworks such as, SAM or something like that. So a lot of them are guessing, I think.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I was excuse me, Denise, I was just speaking for myself. You are absolutely right, Jakub. Absolutely 100% correct. And no disagreement. I was just putting that in the chat, but let me just say this right up front. I was just speaking for myself. I try not to guess because of exactly what you just said. But yeah, that's the most widespread. And then I'll slap a CVSS on it and call it risk.
Yep.
Absolutely. That's also why I like, for example, the access that Dinis proposed, time to fix. I think that's way more important than likelihood of compromise.
By order of magnitude.
If the likelihood is 1 in 100 years, it can still happen tomorrow. What's way more important is, okay, if that happens, how long does it take us to get operational again? And if that is 5 months, that might be a system where you want to pay more attention to.
And that's exactly the thing. Look, and what I found was that, and this is interesting, right? Because look, now see if you can find yourself in this, because I found myself. Do you work more sometimes with the teams that respond to you or the teams that ignored you, right? But the thing about this is the teams that usually respond to you and are super motivated, guess what? They're the teams that making change is easy because they have a great CI pipeline. They I got teams that they run out of things to fix, right? Because they go like, come on, give us, because they view quality and security all in the same go. But that's not your problem because those teams have a lot of already good systems. B, they will detect things very fast. And C, the amount of impact that could occur is small. The worry is the other teams who don't engage, who can't fix things, or who say, look, even if you want to fix, we can't, or it's too complicated, or it's too risky, or we can't do it. Those teams, I think, are much more worried, and you actually should spend more time with them. And actually, it takes to another topic that I actually think in security we should be helping to fund and improve CI pipelines, but that's a different conversation. But because actually, if you look at the threat, you realize the biggest challenge, if I do a Wardley map on these two systems, the biggest challenge to do a security fix is not security champions, is not budget, is not willingness, is not developed understanding of security, is the CI pipeline. So if you do a Wardley map of multiple teams, what I realized was that a lot of teams, the problem is lack of CI pipeline. That was the biggest reason why security fixes didn't went into place. Not if they have developers that understand security, not if they care about security, not about all these other things, right? A CI pipeline is the thing that makes the most difference in a lot of environments to fix things. Because you go from a fix being a massive thing and you can do 2 or 3 and that's it. And then there's another palaver versus, they just keep doing it and they just update it and fix it because it's part of their DNA because they ship every couple of hours or every couple of days.
Dinis, how do you deal with time to fix that in pieces of software that are not under your control?
Well, that's part of the problem, right?
Right.
And that's exactly.
Sorry, good.
No, but then you need to look at, for example, so look at this, right? So imagine you map the time to fix, right? And you have that. Now create another map, which is your log maturity, right? So you have another map that goes from not at all. Hey, we know we have logs. Hey, we can ingest logs. Hey, we can visualize logs. Hey, we can have events on logs. So now you have this maturity, right? Now you map them across and you say, okay, these systems, I have great logs. These systems, I don't have logs. Now, if you correlate one to the other, the ones you should start to freak out are the ones that you cannot make changes and you have no visibility, right? Because in a way, I would argue that the less you can make changes, the more visibility you need to have to what the hell is going on, because you need to have at least some advanced warning, or you need to know when to actually send people doing manual stuff or whatever needs to be done to mitigate the threat.
You can even use Wardley maps to do a mapping on your suppliers, Avi. So you can map the maturity of your suppliers, their time to respond, their time to fix. Yeah. And you can make a horizontal axis with maturity of your suppliers and the suppliers that are way on the right-hand side, as in you complain and they fix it. That's typically the supplier you also have to worry about less. All suppliers that are on the left-hand side, that are first going to object, and then they're going to say, yes, it's on our backlog, call us back in 6 months. And in 6 months' time, you get an answer, this was out of scope. Those are the companies you probably have to worry about, or even maybe have to get away from. And a Wardley map can perfectly visualize which are your problematic suppliers, and because it's a map, where they have impact on. And you can also immediately see if we get rid of this supplier, what will break down, what will happen.
I have lived on both sides of this a lot. And one of the things that doesn't happen, and it's kind of built in, unfortunately, into our vulnerabilities by the pound culture. And that is the fact that we don't necessarily trust when a vendor comes and tries to explain to us that's not as much risk as it looks like from the outside. And, can we trust the vendor being honest? One of the things we've learned is that some vendors over time downplay everything. And I'm thinking of somebody very big that I've had that experience with really badly. And that shoots all the honest vendors who are just saying, yeah, actually, in this context, it's not as much risk as you think, and we'll fix it. Yeah, but we don't think it's right at the very top of our fixes. And that somehow, I don't know what to do about that because that's cultural and systemic. It's really systemic that a few really big vendors have shot everybody else in the foot who are trying to be transparent and honest. And that's a problem that's socio-political, I think.
Yep. Here you're now talking about not responsibility, the time to respond, or how responsible the vendors will be. That's different from time to fix. I mean, you could take something like Google. Fine, they fix things relatively quickly, and they're relatively reliable, and you would put them far to the right in the reliable section, but then they'll get something massive like I don't know, like we've had a bunch of things on cloud platforms lately. I don't remember one specifically for GCP, but that could happen. And then, well, it's going to then take them, I don't know, 45 days to fix something like it took Azure to roll out 35 days to roll out a massive fix because it was so again, so are we mapping for the component? Are we mapping reliability of the vendor? These are two different things, which I feel might get lost in the wash by putting them on the same map there.
But you don't. But also, what's your alternative, right? So the advantage of the map is you can challenge that. The advantage of a map, you can say, what altitude am I looking at this? And then you might go, well, that altitude doesn't matter to me because that's not what I'm after. Or it might matter to you, and you might say, yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. It's quite funny because before mapping, I used to say, I know the security of a product, depending on when I ask for the guidance of a third party, is on the extreme, you have the ones who says, we don't give you anything, we'll sue you if you try to do anything. We're super secure, but we're not telling you. There's the ones in the middle that go, yeah, we'll come back to you, and then come back to a couple of things. And there's the one who give you some data. And they're the ones who basically dump, a massive amount of data, information, guidance, links, and maturity in their processes. Now, guess what? Guess immediately who's going to be secure, right? And this is on a Wardley map, is that who has made security down to be a commodity where it just happens, where they got their act together, versus who the ones with security is completely Genesis. And you go back to your systems that you have in place, and then you correlate that on top of the other map. You go, holy shit, I have super mission critical systems on top of things where the vendor is all over the place. I don't have visibility. I don't have logs. This is a shit show about to happen. And I would argue that in your company, you should focus on that, because until you de-risk it, that's probably where your big problems are going to occur. Not from this bit at the top that, yes, maybe might even get more couple of things, but they get fixed very quickly and the damage is limited.
But that's completely different from trying to fix for a component or.
Well, it all relates, because this guy here is going to have a time to fix that is horrible, and those guys here is going to have a time to fix that is really good. And here's the cool thing, right? On average, yeah, okay, but you need to put into context, right? Like there's things in here that you understand why, because remember that you don't want a situation where you create a biggest vulnerability, right? You create a biggest problem, because availability is also a problem, right? So you don't want a guy who is has a problem of this amount with confidentiality and creates a problem of that amount of integrity and availability, right? So, but what's an area that we haven't talked about, and I think we need to wrap up, but which is, we miss a massive trick by not doing all of this to the business, because also more and more I see a gigantic correlation to all the areas that we find weakness in security to areas that the business has weakness in. I show you a team that is kicking out of the park in security, kicking out of the park in making changes. I show you a team that is performing really well in the business. I show you a team that struggles to make fixes, has all sorts of risks, massive backlog of issues. I show you a team that today is not performing in a business. My experience is almost a one-to-one mapping between those two. And what it means that we should be going to the business and saying, we can make you better because we care. Like legacy systems is a good example. We should get a huge amount of funding to fix legacy systems, because most people in the company don't want to touch it. But from a security point of view, they're one of your biggest problems. So again, Wardley maps and threat modeling allows you to put context into this world.
Don't fix legacy, just get rid of it.
Well, that's fixing it, right? That's one way to fix legacy, right? But on the other hand, you see legacy just hanging around, right? and staying and staying and staying. So
yeah, well, sometimes that's a function of, this is critical and our entire business depends upon it, or half of our business depends on it. And And the problem with legacy, as people leave, it becomes fragile and brittle because people are afraid to go in there. And you're faced not with, can I improve this a little bit, you know, and do some iterative changes, but I'll either have to replace it for $15 million or don't touch it. And that's a very hard decision. You know, we have to get better, I think, at reading poorly documented code, ultimately.
Oh yeah.
You know, and just getting in there and not being quite so afraid and having better, you know, better places to make experiments. Because
you know what?
I have been at company after company where as soon as something becomes legacy, it becomes untouchable, and then you're stuck with it.
Yeah. But you know, one of the best ways to discover and to map legacy is to do a threat model on it, and to do an analysis, and to do a data flow analysis, and to do a security review. It's one of the best ways to document legacy.
Even quicker, shut it off at the firewall and see who complains.
Well,
Yeah.
yes, I have done that, Avi. I have literally done that, and
I did that
had
by
no
accident.
one complain. And oh my gosh, what a win!
Oh yeah, there you go. All right, guys. Any final thoughts? It's been a great session. Thanks, everybody. Any final thoughts?
So I'll say, does Wardley mapping meet my criteria? It actually is really simple if you get the axes correct in a value way. I think I agree that it's actually really fast to do something and teach it really fast. Having said that, I need to go to Jakub's 3-minute thing. I don't know how to get there, but I want to go. I need to go.
I'll meet you there.
Yeah. So what we should do for the next summit is try now to come up with a couple of good examples of what those axes could look like. I think what would be really good is pick up a couple of good threat models and then see, look, let's now try to do the mapping. So we can do this throughout the months and then come back in 2 months from now and pick a couple of examples and say, look, what about this?
Count me in. I'm so down.
I think the same way that OWASP has the threat modeling playbook, it would be great to end up with some sort of cookbook of this thing with the different axes that you could have in this map and what value you can get from them. So
well, that's the prioritization of this Wardley map.
No, even just a set of axes, not finished guides or examples or whatever, just what makes sense to have in terms of axes.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I see Chris sitting there giggling about that.
Nope.
And thanks everyone for dumbing it down for me. it was a journey.
Yeah, just a quick comment on Chris smiling at choosing the axis. I actually asked that question to Simon Wardley, but he just said, choose whatever you want. So here it is.
I did the same thing. I went, what about the value on the left? Like, it doesn't matter. Is A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D, right? I think people sometimes read too much. That's how, like, that's why when I go back in my head, Wardley maps is simply a chain of sequences plus, which goes top to bottom, whatever metric you pick, and an evolution, whatever metric you pick. That's it.
Okay. My take from today is that there are at least 3 ways you could use Wardley mapping and threat modeling. In that third one, you can actually, as the dots, as the entities, you could put threads, or you could put the components of the system, and you have unlimited number of X choices that you can take, and we'll discuss it next time.
Yeah. And one more thing that I'll be very interested in seeing the next time is that last thing that we touched, the storytelling from the map. So, okay, we got the map. We got these arrows and blobs and whatnot and everything. Now, teach me how to tell the story from that map.
Yeah, I think
Tell
that's
the
key.
story and do movement.
And make decisions.
That's details.
But make a decision, right? I think the success story there is that, can you show a map to somebody and let them make the right decision? And the right decision is one that you have context, where we make the right decision sometimes by instinct. I think we get to a point where the right decision becomes obvious, which is what you get with a Wardley map. When you see, why am I investing here versus there? In security, we should arrive at, bring more science, so you're not making stuff up as much as normal.
Yeah.
And if you disagree, and if you disagree about the conclusion, it probably means somebody's missing something on the map.
Yeah, that.
And you go back to it.
That.
Exactly.
Exactly. Oh, that's a great way to end it. There you go. So, gentlemen, thanks for your time.
you.
And I see
Thank
you
you
at
too.
the other sessions of the summit. And let's continue in 2 months from now.
Thanks to everyone. This was
Thanks.
amazing.
Thank you. It was
Bye.
a real pleasure.